Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week we return to the Vale of Earl for the King of Elflands' daughter. This is another one of those episodes I can sit out, because Dunsany is basically paying off his earlier work. I'll note a few things for you to look for on the way through. Orion offers a story to the troll, and the troll accepts it, redefining his statistics. Orion cannot stray into fairy, or his fairy half will claim his mortal half, much as his mother, who we learn here is a half-fae, has also been claimed. The stuff the planets swim in, which is the medium of the great music of Elfland, is ether, but for our purposes is the Vim ocean that pours about the earth and seems to be part of Arcadia. The Elf King's power calls down the demons from the sky and makes Cthulhunoid horrors wake and dance in their caverns. Thanks again to Joy Chan for her recording and the whole LibriVox team for the production.
Chapter 22, Orion Appoints a Whip. And many times again, while the winter wore away, Orion went back again with his hounds to that wonderful boundary, and waited there while the earthly twilight faded, and sometimes saw the unicorns come through, craftily, silently, when our fields were still, great beautiful shapes of white. But he brought back no more horns to the castle of Earl, nor hunted again across the fields we know, for the unicorns, when they came, moved into our fields no more than a few bare paces, and Orion was not able to cut one off again. Once when he tried, he nearly lost all his hounds, some being already within the boundary when he beat them back with his whip. Another 2 yards, and the sound of his earthly horn could never more have reached them. It was this that taught him that for all the power that he had over his hounds, and even though in that power was something of magic, yet one man without help could not hunt hounds so near to that edge, over which if one should stray it would be lost forever. After this, Orion watched the lads at their games in evenings at Earl, till he had marked 3 that in speed and strength seemed to excel the rest, and 2 of these he chose to be whippers in. He went to the cottage of one of them when the games were over, just as the lights were lit, a tall lad with great speed of limb. The lad and his mother were there, and both rose from the table as the father opened the door and Orion came in. And cheerily Orion asked the lad if he would come with the hounds, and carry a whip, and prevent any from straying. And a silence fell. All knew that Orion hunted strange beasts, and took his hounds to strange places. None there had ever stepped beyond the fields we know. The lad feared to pass beyond them. His parents were full of loath to let him go. At length the silence was broken by excuses and muttered sentences and unfinished things, and Orion saw that the lad would not come. He went then to the house of the other. There too the candles were lit and a table spread. There were 2 old women there, and the lad at their supper. And to them Orion told how he needed a whipper in, and asked the lad to come. Their fear in that house was more marked. The old women cried out together that the lad was too young, that he could not run so well as he used to, that he was not worthy of so great an honor, that dogs never would trust him. And much more than this they said, till they became incoherent. Orion left them and went to the house of the third. It was the same here. The elders had desired magic for Earl, but the actual touch of it, or the mere thought of it, perturbed the folk in their cottages. None would spare their sons to go whither they knew not, to have dealings with things that rumor, like a large and sinister shadow, had so grimly magnified in the hamlet of Earl. So Orion went alone with his hounds when he took them up from the valley, and went eastwards over our fields where earth's folks would not go. It was late in the month of March, and Orion slept in his tower, when there came up to him from far below, shrill and clear in the early morning, the sound of his peacocks calling. The bleat of sheep far up on the downs came to wake him too, and cocks were crowing clamorously, for spring was singing through the sunny air. He rose and went to his hounds, and soon early laborers saw him go up the steep side of the valley with all his hounds behind him, tan patches against the green. And so he passed over the fields we know. And so he was come, before the sun had set, to that strip of land from which all men turned away, where westward stood men's houses among fields of fat brown clay, and eastward the elfin mountains shone over the boundary of twilight. He went with his hounds along the last hedge down to the boundary, and no sooner had he come there than he saw a fox quite close slip out of the twilight between earth and Elfland, and run a few yards along the edge of our fields, and then slip back again. And of this Orion thought nothing, for it is the way of the fox thus to haunt the edge of Elfland, and to return again to our fields. It is thus that he brings us something of which none of our cities guess. But soon the fox appeared again out of the twilight, and ran a little way, and was back in the luminous barrier once more. Then Orion watched to see what the fox was doing, and yet again it appeared in the fields we know, and dodged back into the twilight, and the hounds watched too, and showed no longing to hunt it, for they had tasted fabulous blood. Orion walked along beside the twilight in the direction in which the fox was going, with his curiosity growing the more that the fox dodged in and out of our fields. The hounds followed him slowly, and soon lost interest in what the fox was doing. And all at once the curious thing was explained, for Luraloo all of a sudden skipped through the twilight, and that troll appeared in our fields. It was with him that the fox was playing. "A man," said Luraloo aloud to himself, or to his comrade the fox, speaking in troll talk. And all at once Orion remembered the troll that had come into his nursery with his little charm against time, and had leapt from shelf to shelf and across the ceiling, and enraged Zerundarel, who had feared for her crockery. "The troll," he said, also in troll talk, for his mother had murmured it to him as a child when she told him the tales of the trolls and their age-old songs. "Who is this that knows troll talk?" said Luraloo. And Orion told his name, and this meant nothing to Luraloo, but he squatted down and rummaged a little while in what answers in trolls to our memory, and during his ransacking of much trivial remembrance that had eluded the destruction of time in the fields we know, and the listless apathy of unchanging ages in Elfland, he came all at once on his remembrance of Earl, and looked at Orion again and began to cogitate. And at this same moment Orion told to the troll the august name of his mother. At once Luraloo made what is known amongst the trolls of Elfland as the abasement of the 5 points. That is to say, he bowed himself to the ground on his 2 knees, his 2 hands, and his forehead. Then he sprang up again with a high leap into the air, for reverence rested not on his spirit long. "What are you doing in men's fields?" said Orion. "Playing," said Luraloo. "What do you do in Elfland?" "Watch time." "That would not amuse me," said Orion. "You've never done it," said Luraloo. "You cannot watch time in the fields of men." "Why not?" "It moves too fast." Orion pondered a while on this, but could make nothing of it, because, never having gone from the fields we know, he knew only 1 pace of time, and so had no means of comparison. "How many years have gone over you," asked the troll, "since we spoke in Earl?" "Years?" said Orion. 100, guessed the troll. "Nearly 12, said Orion. "And you?" "It is still today." And Orion would not speak any more of time, for he cared not for the discussion of a subject of which he appeared to know less than a common troll. "Will you carry a whip," he said, "and run with my hounds when we hunt the unicorn over the fields we know?" Luraloo looked searchingly at the hounds, watching their brown eyes. The hounds turned doubtful noses towards the troll, and sniffed inquiringly. "They are dogs," said the troll, as though that were against them. "Yet they have pleasant thoughts." "Will you carry the whip, then?" said Orion. "Yes, yes," said the Troll. So Orion gave him his own whip there and then, and blew his horn, and went away from the twilight, and told Lurloo to keep the hounds together, and to bring them on behind. And the hounds were uneasy at the sight of the Troll, and sniffed again, but could not make him human, and were loath to obey a creature no larger than them. They ran up to him through curiosity, and ran away in disgust, and straggled through disobedience. But the boundless resources of that nimble Troll were not thus easily thwarted, and the whip went suddenly up, looking 3 times as large in that tiny hand, and the lash flew forward and cracked on the tip of a hound's nose. The hound yelped, then looked astonished, and the rest were uneasy still. They must have thought it an accident. But again the lash shot forward and cracked on another nose tip, and the hounds saw then that it was not chance that guided those stinging shots, but a deadly unerring eye. And from that time on they reverenced Lurloo, although he never smelt human. So went Orion and his pack of hounds in the late evening homewards, and no sheep-dog kept the flock on wolf-haunted wold safer or closer than Lurloo kept the pack. He was on each flank or behind them, wherever a straggler was, and could leap right over the pack from side to side. And the pale blue elfin mountains faded from view before Orion had gone from the frontier as much as 100 paces, for their gloomless peaks were hid by the earthly darkness that was deepening wide over the fields we know. Homeward they went, and soon there appeared above them the wandering multitude of our earth-seen stars. Lurloo now and then looked up to marvel at them, as we have all done at some time. But for the most part he fixed his attention on the hounds, for now that he was in earthly fields he was concerned with things of earth. And never one hound loitered but that Lurloo's whip would touch him with its tiny explosion, perhaps on the tip of its tail, scattering a little dust of fragments of hair and whipcord, and the hound would yelp and run into the others, and all the pack would know that another of those unerring shots had gone home. A certain grace with the whip, a certain sureness of aim, comes when a life is devoted to the carrying of a whip amongst hounds, comes, say, in 20 years, and sometimes it runs in families, and that is better than years of practice. But neither years of practice nor the want of the whip in the blood can give the certain aim that one thing can, and that one thing is magic. The hurl of the lash as immediate as the sudden turn of an eye, its flash to a chosen spot as direct as sight, were not of this earth. And though the cracks of that whip might have seemed to passing men to be no more than the work of an earthly huntsman, yet not a hound but knew that there was in it more than this, a thing from beyond our fields. There was a touch of dawn in the sky when Orion saw again the village of Earl, sending up pillars of smoke from early fires below him, and came with his hounds and his new whipper in down the side of the valley. Early windows winked at him as he went down the street, and came in the silence and chill to the empty kennels. And when the hounds were all curled up on their straw, he found a place for Lurloo, a mouldering loft in which were sacks and a few heaps of hay. From a pigeon loft just beyond it, some of the pigeons had strayed and dwelt all along the rafters. There Orion left Lurloo and went to his tower, cold with the want of sleep and food, and weary as he would not have been if he had found a unicorn, but the noise of the Troll's chatter when he had found him on the frontier had made it useless to watch for those wary beasts that evening. Orion slept, but the Troll in the mouldering loft sat long on his bundle of hay, observing the ways of time. He saw through cracks in old shutters the stars go moving by. He saw them pale. He saw the other lights spread. He saw the wonder of sunrise. He felt the gloom of the loft all full of the coo of the pigeons. He watched their restless ways. He heard wild birds stir in near elms, and men abroad in the morning, and horses and carts and cows, and everything changing as the morning grew. A land of change. The decay of the boards in the loft and the moss outside in the mortar, and old lumber mouldering away, all seemed to tell the same story. Change, and nothing abiding. He thought of the age-old calm that held the beauty of Elfland, and then he thought of the tribe of trolls he had left, wondering what they would think of the ways of earth. And the pigeons were suddenly terrified by wild peals of Lurlu's laughter. Chapter 23. Lurlu watches the restlessness of earth. As the day wore on, and still Orion slept heavily, and even the hounds lay silent in their kennels a little way off, and the coming and going of men and carts below had nothing to do with the troll, Lurlu began to feel lonely. So thick are the brown trolls in the dells they inhabit that none feels lonely there. They sit there silent, enjoying the beauty of Elfland or their own impudent thoughts, or at rare moments when Elfland is stirred from its deep natural calm, their laughter floods the dells. They were no more lonely there than rabbits are. But in all the fields of earth there was only one troll, and that troll felt lonely. The door of the pigeon loft was open some 10 feet from the door of the hayloft, and some 6 feet higher. A ladder led to the hayloft, clamped to the wall with iron, but nothing at all communicated with the pigeon loft, lest cats should go that way. From it came the murmur of abundant life, which attracted the lonely troll. The jump from door to door was nothing to him, and he landed in the pigeon loft in his usual attitude, with a look of impudent welcome upon his face. But the pigeons poured away on a roar of wings through their windows, and the troll was still lonely. He liked the pigeon loft as soon as he looked at it. He liked the signs that he saw of teeming life, the 100 little houses of slate and plaster, the myriad feathers, and the musty smell. He liked the age-old ease of the sleepy loft, and the huge spider webs that draped the corners, holding years and years of dust. He did not know what cobwebs were, never having seen them in Elfland, but he admired their workmanship. The age of the pigeon loft, that had filled the corners with cobwebs, and broken patches of plaster away from the wall, showing ruddy bricks beneath, and laid bare the laths in the roof, and even the slates beyond, gave to the dreamy place an air not unlike to the calm of Elfland, but below it and all around Lurlu noted the restlessness of earth. Even the sunlight through the little ventilation holes that shone on the wall moved. Presently there came a roar of the pigeons' returning wings, and the crash of their feet on the slate roof above him, but they did not yet come in again to their homes. He saw the shadow of this roof cast on another roof below him, and the restless shadows of the pigeons along the edge. He observed the gray lichen covering most of the lower roof, and the neat round patches of newer yellow lichen on the shapeless mass of the gray. He heard a duck call out slowly 6 or 7 times. He heard a man come into the stable below him and lead a horse away. A hound woke and cried out. Some jackdaws, disturbed from some tower, passed over high in the air with boisterous voices. He saw big clouds go hurrying along the tops of far hills. He heard a wild pigeon call from a neighboring tree. Some men went by talking, and after a while he perceived to his astonishment what he had had no leisure to notice on his previous visit to Earl, that even the shadows of houses moved, for he saw that the shadow of the roof under which he sat had moved a little on the roof below, over the gray and yellow lichen. Perpetual movement and perpetual change. He contrasted it in wonder with the deep calm of his home, where the moment moved more slowly than the shadows of houses here, and did not pass until all the content with which a moment is stored had been drawn from it by every creature in Elfland. And then, with a whirring and whining of wings, the pigeons began to come back. They came from the tops of the battlements of the highest tower of Earl, on which they had sheltered a while, feeling guarded by its great height and its hoary age from this strange new thing that they feared. They came back and sat on the sills of their little windows and looked in with one eye at the troll. Some were all white, but the gray ones had rainbow-colored necks that were scarce less lovely than those colors that made the splendor of Elfland. and Luraloo, as they watched him suspiciously where he sat still in a corner, longed for their dainty companionship. And when these restless children of the restless air and earth still would not enter, he tried to soothe them with the restlessness to which they were accustomed, and in which he believed all folk that dwelt in our fields delighted. He leaped up suddenly. He sprang on to a slate-built house for a pigeon high on the wall. He darted across to the next wall and back to the floor. But there was an outcry of wings, and the pigeons were gone. And gradually he learned that the pigeons preferred stillness. Their wings roared back soon to the roof, their feet thumped and clicked on the slates again, but not for a long time did they return to their homes. And the lonely troll looked out of their windows, observing the ways of earth. He saw a water wagtail light on the roof below him. He watched it until it went. And then 2 sparrows came to some corn that had been dropped on the ground. He noted them too. Each was an entirely new genus to the troll, and he showed no more interest as he watched every movement of the sparrows than should we if we met with an utterly unknown bird. When the sparrows were gone, the duck quacked again, so deliberately that another 10 minutes passed while Luraloo tried to interpret what it was saying. And though he desisted then because other interests attracted him, he felt sure it was something important. Then the jackdaws tumbled by again, but their voices sounded frivolous, and Luraloo did not give them much attention. To the pigeons on the roof that would not come home, he listened long, not trying to interpret what they were saying, yet satisfied with the case, as the pigeons put it, feeling that they told the story of life, and that all was well. And he felt as he listened to the low talk of the pigeons that earth must have been going on for a long time. Beyond the roofs the tall trees rose up, leafless except for evergreen oaks, and some laurels and pines and yews, and the ivy that climbed up trunks. But the buds of the beech were getting ready to burst, and the sunlight glittered and flashed on the buds and leaves, and the ivy and laurel shone. A breeze passed by, and some smoke drifted from some near chimney. Far away Luraloo saw a huge grey wall of stone that circled a garden all asleep in the sun, and clear in the sunlight he saw a butterfly sail by and swoop when it came to the garden. And then he saw 2 peacocks go slowly past. He saw the shadow of the roofs darkening the lower part of the shining trees. He heard a cock crow somewhere, and a hound spoke out again. And then a sudden shower rained on the roofs, and at once the pigeons wanted to come home. They alighted outside their little windows again, and all looked sideways at the troll. Luraloo kept very still this time, and after a while the pigeons, though they saw that he was by no means one of themselves, agreed that he did not belong to the tribe of cat, and returned at last to the street of their tiny houses, and there continued their age-old tale. And Luraloo longed to repay them with curious tales of the trolls, the treasured legends of Elfland, but he found that he could not make them understand troll talk. So he sat and listened to them talking, till it seemed to him they were trying to lull the restlessness of earth, and thought that they might, by drowsy incantation, be putting some spell against time, through which it could not come to harm their nests, for the power of time was not made clear to him yet, and he knew not yet that nothing in our fields has the strength to hold out against time. The very nests of the pigeons were built on the ruins of old nests, on a solid layer of crumbled things that time had made in that pigeon loft, as outside it the strata are made from the ruins of hills. So vast and ceaseless a ruin was not yet clear to the troll, for his sharp understanding had only been meant to guide him through the lull and the calm of Elfland, and he busied himself with a tinier consideration. Foreseeing that the pigeons seemed now amicable, he leapt back to his hayloft, and returned with a bundle of hay, which he put down in a corner to make himself comfortable there. When the pigeons saw all this movement, they looked at him sideways again, jerking their necks queerly, but in the end decided to accept the troll as a lodger, and he curled up on his hay and listened to the history of earth, which he believed the tale of the pigeons to be, though he did not know their language. But the day wore on, and hunger came on the Troll far sooner than ever it did in Elfland, where even when he was hungry he had no more to do than to reach up and take the berries that hung low from the trees that grew in the forest that bordered the dells of the Trolls. And it is because the Trolls eat them whenever hunger comes on them, which it rarely does, that these curious fruits are called troll berries. He leaped now from the pigeon loft and scampered abroad, looking all around for troll berries. And there were no berries at all, for there is but one season for berries, as we know well. It is one of the tricks of time. But that all the berries on earth should pass away for a period was to the Troll too astounding to be comprehended at all. He was all among farm buildings, and presently he saw a rat humping himself slowly along through a dark shed. He knew nothing of rat talk, but it is a curious thing that when any two folk are after the same thing, each somehow knows what the other is after at once, as soon as he sees him. We are all partially blind to other folks' occupations, but when we meet anyone engaged in our own pursuit, then somehow we soon seem to know without being told. At the moment that Lorelei saw the rat in the shed, he seemed to know that it was looking for food. So he followed the rat quietly, and soon the rat came up to a sack of oats, and to open that took him no longer than it does to shell a row of peas, and soon he was eating the oats. "Are they good?" said the Troll in Troll talk. The rat looked at him dubiously, noting his resemblance to man, and on the other hand his unlikeness to dogs. But on the whole the rat was dissatisfied, and after a long look he turned away in silence and went out of the shed. Then Lorelei ate the oats and found they were good. When he had had enough oats, the Troll returned to the pigeon loft and sat a long while there at one of the little windows, looking out across the roofs at the strange new ways of time. And the shadows upon the trees went higher, and the glitter was gone from the laurels and all the lower leaves. And then the light of the ivy leaves and the holm oaks turned from silvery to pale gold, and the shadow went higher still, all the world full of change. An old man with a narrow, long white beard came slowly to the kennels and opened the door and went in and fed the hounds with meat that he brought from a shed. All the evening rang with the hounds' outcry. And presently the old man came out again, and his slow departure seemed to the watchful Troll yet more of the restlessness of earth. And then a man came slowly, leading a horse to the stable below the pigeon loft, and went away again and left the horse eating. The shadows were higher now on walls and roofs and trees. Only the tree-tops and the tip of a high belfry had the light any longer. The ruddy buds on high beeches were glowing now like dull rubies, and a great serenity came in the pale blue sky, and small clouds leisurely floating there turned to a flaming orange, past which the rooks went homewards to some clump of trees under the downs. It was a peaceful scene. And yet to the Troll, as he watched in the musty loft amongst generations of feathers, the noise of the rooks and their multitude thronging the sky, the dull continual sound of the horse eating, the leisurely sound now and then of homeward feet, and the slow shutting of gates, seemed to be proof that nothing ever rested in all the fields we know, and the sleeping lazy village that dreamed in the vale of Earl, and that knew no more of other lands than their folk knew of its story, seemed to that simple Troll to be a vortex of restlessness. And now the sunlight was gone from the highest places, and a moon a few days old was shining over the pigeon loft, out of sight of Lorelei's window, but filling the air with a strange new tint. And all these changes bewildered him, so that he thought a while of returning to Elfland. But the whim came again to his mind to astonish the other Trolls, and while this whim was on him, he slipped down from the loft and went to find Orion. Chapter 24. Lorelei speaks of Earth and the ways of men. The Troll had found Orion in his castle and had laid his plan before him. Briefly, the plan was to have more whips for the pack. for one alone could not always guard every hound from straying when they went to the boundary of twilight, where but a few yards away lay spaces from which if a hound ever came home, as lost hounds do at evening, it would come home all worn and bedraggled with age for its half-hour of straying. Each hound, said Lorelei, should have its troll to guide it and to run with it when it hunted, and be its servant when it came home hungry and muddy. And Orion had seen at once the unequaled advantage of having each hound controlled by an alert, if tiny, intelligence, and had told Lorelei to go for the trolls. So now, while the hounds were sleeping on boards in a doggy mass in each of their kennels, for the dogs and the bitches dwelt each in a separate house, the troll was scurrying over the fields we know, through twilight, trembling on the verge of moonlight, with his face turned toward Elfland. He passed a white farmhouse with a little window towards him that shone bright yellow out of a wall pale blue with a tint that it had from the moon. 2 dogs barked at him and rushed out to chase him, and this troll would have tricked them and mocked them on any other day, but now his mind was full to the brim with his mission, and he heeded them no more than a thistledown would have heeded them on a windy day of September, and went on bouncing over the tips of the grasses till the pursuing dogs were far behind and panting. And long before the stars had paled from any touch of the dawn, he came to the barrier that divides our fields from the home of such things as him, and leaping forward out of the earthly night and high through the barrier of twilight, he arrived on all fours on his natal soil in the ageless day of Elfland. Through the gorgeous beauty of that heavy air that outshines our lakes at sunrise, and leaves all our colors pale, he scampered full of the news he had with which to astonish his kith. He came to the moors of the trolls, where they dwell in their queer habitations, and uttered the squeaks as he went, whereby the trolls summon their folk. And he came to the forest in which the trolls have made dwellings in boles of enormous trees, and there be trolls of the forest and trolls of the moor, 2 tribes that are friendly in kin, and there he uttered again the squeaks of the trolls' summons. And soon there was a rustling of flowers throughout the deeps of the forest, as though all 4 winds were blowing, and the rustling grew and grew, and the trolls appeared and sat down one by one near Lorelei. And still the rustling grew, troubling the whole wood, and the brown trolls poured on and sat down round Lorelei. From many a tree bole and hollows thick with fern they came tumbling in, and from the high thin gomacs afar on the moors, to name as are named in Elfland those queer habitations for which there is no earthly name, the odd grey cloth-like material draped tent-wise about a pole. They gathered about him in the dim but glittering light that floated amongst the fronds of those magical trees, whose soaring trunks outdistanced our eldest pines, and shone on the spikes of cacti, of which our world little dreams. And when the brown mass of the trolls was all gathered there, till the floor of the forest looked as though an autumn had come to Elfland, strayed out of the fields we know, and when all the rustling had ceased, and the silence was heavy again as it had been for ages, Lorelei spoke to them, telling them tales of time. Never before had such tales been heard in Elfland. Trolls had appeared before in the fields we know, and had come back wondering. But Lorelei amongst the houses of Earl had been in the midst of men, and time, as he told the trolls, moved in the village with more wonderful speed than ever it did in the grass of the fields of earth. He told how the light moved. He told of the shadows. He told how the air was white and bright and pale. He told how for a little while earth began to grow like Elfland, with a kinder light and the beginning of colors, and then just as one thought of home, the light would blink away and the colors be gone. He told of stars. He told of cows and goats and the moon, 3-horned creatures that he found curious. He had found more wonder in earth than we remember, though we also saw these things once for the first time, and out of the wonder he felt at the ways of the fields we know, he made many a tale that held the inquisitive trolls and gripped them silent upon the floor of the forest, as though they were indeed a fall of brown leaves in October that a frost had suddenly bound. They heard of chimneys and carts for the first time. With a thrill they heard of windmills. They listened spellbound to the ways of men, and every now and then, as when he told of hats, there ran through the forest a wave of little yelps of laughter. Then he said that they should see hats and spades in dog kennels, and look through casements and get to know the windmill, and a curiosity arose in the forest among that brown mass of trolls, for their race is profoundly inquisitive. And Lureloo stopped not here, relying on curiosity alone to draw them from Elfland into the fields we know, but he drew them also with another emotion. For he spoke of the haughty, reserved, high, glittering unicorns who tarry to speak to trolls no more than cattle when they drink in pools of ours trouble to speak to frogs. They all knew their haunts, they should watch their ways, and tell of these things to man, and the outcome of it would be that they should hunt the unicorns with nothing less than dogs. Now, however slight their knowledge of dogs, the fear of dogs is, as I have said, universal amongst all creatures that run, and they laughed gustily to think of the unicorns being hunted with dogs. Thus Lureloo lured them toward earth with spite and curiosity, and knew that he was succeeding, and inwardly chuckled till he was well warmed within. For amongst the trolls none goes in higher repute than one that is able to astound the others, or even to show them any whimsical thing, or to trick or perplex them humorously. Lureloo had earth to show, whose ways are considered, amongst those able to judge, to be fully as quaint and whimsical as the curious observer could wish. Then up spake a grizzled troll, one that had crossed too often earth's border of twilight to watch the ways of men, and while watching their ways too long, time had grizzled him. "Shall we go," he said, "from a woods that all folk know, and the pleasant ways of the land, to see a new thing and be swept away by time?" And there was a murmur among the trolls that hummed away through the forest and died out, as on earth the sound of beetles going home. "Is it not today?" he said. "But there they call it today, yet none knows what it is. Come back through the border again to look at it, and it is gone. Time is raging there, like the dogs that stray over our frontier, barking, frightened and angry and wild to be home." "It is even so," said the trolls, though they did not know. But this was a troll whose words carried weight in the forest. "Let us keep today," said that weighty troll, "while we have it, and not be lured where today is too easily lost. For every time men lose it, their hair grows whiter, their limbs grow weaker, and their faces sadder, and they are nearer still to tomorrow." So gravely he spoke when he uttered that word tomorrow that the brown trolls were frightened. "What happens tomorrow?" one said. "They die," said the grizzled troll, "and the others dig in their earth and put them in, as I have seen them do, and then they go to heaven, as I have heard them tell." And a shudder went through the trolls far over the floor of the forest. And Lureloo, who had sat angry all this while, to hear the weighty trolls speak ill of earth, where he would have them come to astonish them with its quaintness, spoke now in defense of heaven. "Heaven is a good place," he blurted hotly, though any tales he had heard of it were few. "All the blessed are there," the grizzled troll replied, "and it is full of angels. What chance would a troll have there? The angels would catch him, for they say on earth that the angels all have wings. They would catch a troll and smack him for ever and ever." and all the brown trolls in the forest wept. "We are not so easily caught," Luraloo said. "They have wings," said the grizzled troll, and all were sorrowful and shook their heads, for they knew the speed of wings. The birds of Elfland mostly soared on the heavy air and eyed everlastingly the fabulous beauty which to them was food and nest, and of which they sometimes sang. But trolls playing along the border, peering into the fields we know, had seen the dart and the swoop of earthly birds, wondering at them as we wonder at heavenly things, and knew that if wings were after him, a poor troll would scarcely escape. "Well-a-day," said the trolls. The grizzled troll said no more, and had no need to, for the forest was full of their sadness as they sat thinking of heaven and feared that they soon might come there if they dared to inhabit earth. And Luraloo argued no more. It was not a time for argument, for the trolls were too sad for reason. So he spoke gravely to them of solemn things, uttering learned words and standing in reverent attitude. Now nothing rejoices the trolls as learning does, and solemnity, and they will laugh for hours at a reverend attitude or any semblance of gravity. Thus he won them back again to the levity that is their natural mood. And when this was accomplished, he spoke again of earth, telling whimsical stories of the ways of man. I do not wish to write the things that Luraloo said of man, lest I should hurt my reader's self-esteem, and thereby injure him or her whom I seek only to entertain. But all the forest rippled and squealed with laughter, and the grizzled troll was able to say no more to check the curiosity which was growing in all that multitude, to see who it was that lived in houses and had a hat immediately above him and a chimney higher up, and spoke to dogs and would not speak to pigs, and whose gravity was funnier than anything trolls could do. And the whim was on all those trolls to go at once to earth and see pigs and carts and windmills and laugh at man. And Luraloo, who had told Orion that he would bring a score of trolls, was hard set to keep the whole brown mass from coming, so quickly changed the moods and whims of the trolls. Had he let them all have their way, there would be no trolls left in Elfland, for even the grizzled troll had changed his mind with the rest. 50 he chose, and led them towards earth's perilous frontier, and away they scurried out of the gloom of the forest, as a whirl of brown oak leaves scurries on days of November's worst. Chapter 25. Lyrazel Remembers the Fields We Know. As the trolls scurried earthwards to laugh at the ways of man, Lyrazel stirred where she sat on her father's knee, whose grave and calm on his throne of mist and ice had hardly moved for 12 of our earthly years. She sighed, and the sigh rippled over the fells of dream and lightly troubled Elfland. And the dawns and the sunsets and twilight and the pale blue glow of stars that are blended together forever to be the light of Elfland felt a faint touch of sorrow, and all their radiance shook. For the magic that caught these lights and the spells that bound them together to illumine forever the land that owes no allegiance to time were not so strong as a sorrow rising dark from a royal mood of a princess of the elvish line. She sighed, for through her long content and across the calm of Elfland there had floated a thought of earth. So that in the midmost splendors of Elfland, of which song can barely tell, she called to mind common cowslips and many a trivial weed of the fields we know. And walking in those fields she saw, in fancy, Orion, upon the other side of the boundary of twilight, remote from her by she knew not what waste of years. And the magical glories of Elfland, and its beauty beyond our dreaming, and the deep, deep calm in which ages slept, unhurt, unhurried by time, and the art of her father that guarded the least of the lilies from fading, and the spells by which he made daydreams and yearnings true, held her fancy no longer from roving, nor contented her any more. And so her sigh blew over the magical land, and slightly troubled the flowers. And her father felt her sorrow, and knew that it troubled the flowers, and knew that it shook the calm that lay upon Elfland, though no more than a bird would shake a regal curtain, fluttering against its folds, when wandering lost upon a summer's night. And though he knew, too, it was but for earth that she sorrowed, preferring some mundane way to the midmost glories of Elfland, as she sat with him on the throne that may only be told of in song, yet even this moved nothing in his magical heart but compassion, as we might pity a child who, in fanes that to us seemed sacred, might be found to be sighing for some trivial thing. And the more that earth seemed to him unworthy of sorrow, being soon come, soon gone, the helpless prey of time, an evanescent appearance seen off the coasts of Elfland, too brief for the graver care of a mind weighted with magic, the more he pitied his child for her errant whim that had rashly wandered here and become entangled, alas, with the things that pass away. Ah, well, she was not content. He felt no wrath against earth that had lured her fancies away. She was not content with the innermost splendors of Elfland, but she sighed for something more. His tremendous art should give it. So he raised his right arm up from the thing whereon it rested, a part of his mystical throne that was made of music and mirage. He raised his right arm up, and a hush fell over Elfland. The great leaves ceased from their murmur through the green deep of the forest. Silent as carven marble were fabulous bird and monster, and the brown trolls scampering earthwards all halted, suddenly hushed. Then out of the hush rose little murmurs of yearning, little sounds as of longing for things that no songs can say, sounds like the voices of tears, if each little salt drop could live, and be given a voice to tell of the ways of grief. Then all these little rumours danced gravely into a melody that the master of Elfland called up with his magical hand. And the melody told of dawn coming up over infinite marshes, far away upon earth or some planet that Elfland did not know, growing slowly out of deep darkness and starlight and bitter cold, powerless, chilly and cheerless, scarce overcoming the stars, obscured by shadows of thunder and hated by all things dark, enduring, growing, and glowing, until through the gloom of the marshes and across the chill of the air came all in a glorious moment the splendor of color. And dawn went onward with this triumphant thing, and the blackest clouds turned slowly rose, and rode in a sea of lilac, and the darkest rocks that had guarded night shone now with a golden glow. And when his melody could say no more of this wonder that had forever been foreign to all the elvish dominions, then the king moved his hand where he held it high, as one might beckon to birds, and called up a dawn over Elfland, luring it from some planet of those that are nearest the sun. And fresh and fair though it came from beyond the bourne of geography, and out of an age long lost and beyond history's ken, a dawn glowed upon Elfland that had known no dawn before. And the dewdrops of Elfland, slung from the bended tips of the grasses, gathered in that dawn to their tiny spheres, and held there, shining and wonderful, that glory of skies such as ours, the first they had ever seen. And the dawn grew strangely and slowly over those unwonted lands, pouring upon them the colors that day after day our daffodils, and day after day our wild roses, through all the weeks of their season, drink deep with voluptuous assemblies in utterly silent riot. And a gleam that was new to the forest appeared on the long strange leaves, and shadows unknown to Elfland slipped out from the monstrous tree boles, and stole over grasses that had not dreamed of their advent. And the spires of that palace, perceiving a wonder, less lovely indeed than they, yet knew that the stranger was magic, and uttered an answering gleam from their sacred windows, that flashed over elvish fells like an inspiration, and mingled a flush of rose with the blue of the elfin mountains. and watchers on wonderful peaks that gazed from their crags for ages, lest from earth or from any stars should come a stranger to Elfland, saw the first blush of the sky as it felt the coming of dawn, and raised their horns and blew that call that warned Elfland against a stranger. And the guardians of savage valleys lifted horns of fabulous bulls and blew the call again in the dark of their awful precipices. And echo carried it on from the monstrous marble faces of rocks that repeated the call to all their barbarous company. So Elfland rang with the warning that a strange thing troubled her coasts. And to the land thus expectant, thus watchful, with magical sabres elate along lonely crags, summoned from blackened scabbards by those horns to repel an enemy, dawn came now, wide, now golden, the old, old wonder we know. And the palace, with every marvel, and with all its charms and enchantments, flashed out of its ice-blue radiance, a glory of welcome or rivalry, adding to Elfland a splendor of which only song may say. It was then that the Elfin king moved his hand again, where he held it high by the crystal spires of his crown, and waved away through the walls of his magical palace, and showed to Lirazel the unmeasured leagues of his kingdom. And she saw by magic, for so long as his fingers made that spell, the dark green forests, and all the fells of Elfland, and the solemn pale blue mountains, and the valleys that weird folk guarded, and all the creatures of fable that crept in the dark of huge leaves, and the riotous trolls as they scampered away towards earth. She saw the watchers lift their horns to their lips, while there flashed a light on the horns that was the proudest triumph of the hidden art of her father, the light of a dawn lured over unthinkable spaces to appease his daughter and comfort her whims and recall her fancies from earth. She saw the lawns whereon time had idled for centuries, withering not one bloom of all the boundary of flowers, and the new light coming upon the lawns she loved, through the heavy color of Elfland, gave them a beauty that they had never known until dawn made this boundless journey to meet the enchanted twilight. And all the while there glowed and flashed and glittered those palace spires of which only song may tell. From that bewildering beauty he turned his eyes away, and looked in his daughter's face to see the wonder with which she would welcome her glorious home as her fancies came back from the fields of age and death, whither, alas, they had wandered. And though her eyes were turned to the elfin mountains, whose mystery and whose blue they strangely matched, yet as the elf-king looked in those eyes, for which alone he had lured the dawn so far from its natural courses, he saw in their magical deeps a thought of earth. A thought of earth, though he had lifted his arm and made a mystical sign with all his might to bring a wonder to Elfland that should content her with home. And all his dominions had exulted in this, and the watchers on awful crags had blown strange calls, and monster and insect and bird and flower had rejoiced with a new joy, and there in the center of Elfland his daughter thought of earth. Had he shown her any wonder but dawn, he might have lured home that fancy. But in bringing this exotic beauty to Elfland, to blend with its ancient wonders, he awoke memories of morning coming over fields that he knew not, and Lirazel played in fancy in fields once more with Orion, where grew the unenchanted earthly flowers amongst the English grasses. "Is it not enough?" he said in his strange, rich, magical voice, and pointed across his wide lands with the fingers that summoned wonder. She sighed. It was not enough. And sorrow came upon that enchanted king. He had only his daughter, and she sighed for earth. There had been once a queen that had reigned with him over Elfland, but she was mortal, and being mortal, died. for she would often stray to the hills of earth to see the May again, or to see the beech woods in autumn. And though she stayed but a day when she came to the fields we know, and was back in the palace beyond the twilight before our sun had set, yet time found her whenever she came, and so she wore away. And soon she died in Elfland, for she was only a mortal. And wandering elves had buried her, as one buries the daughters of men. And now the king was all alone with his daughter, and she had just sighed for earth. Sorrow was on him. But out of the dark of that sorrow arose, as often with men, and went up singing out of his mourning mind, an inspiration gleaming with laughter and joy. He stood up then and raised up both his arms, and his inspiration broke over Elfland in music. And with the tide of that music there went, like the strength of the sea, an impulse to rise and dance, which none in Elfland resisted. Gravely he waved his arms, and the music floated from them, and all that stalked through the forest, and all that crept upon leaves, all that leaped among craggy heights, or browsed upon acres of lilies, all things in all manner of places, yea, the sentinel guarding his presence, the lonely mountain watchers, and the trolls as they scampered towards earth, all danced to a tune that was made of the spirit of spring arrived on an earthly morning amongst happy herds of goats. And the trolls were very near to the frontier now, their faces already puckered to laugh at the ways of men. They were hurrying with all the eagerness of small vain things to be over the twilight that lies between Elfland and earth. Now they went forward no longer, but only glided in circles and intricate spirals, dancing some such dance as the gnats in summer evenings dance over the fields we know. And grave monsters of fable, in deeps of the ferny forest, danced minuets that witches had made of their whims and their laughter, long ago, in their youth, before cities had come to the world. And the trees of the forest heavily lifted slow roots out of the ground, and swayed upon them uncouthly, and then danced as on monstrous claws, and the insects danced on huge waving leaves, and in the dark of long caverns weird things in enchanted seclusion rose out of their age-long sleep and danced in the damp. And beside the wizard king stood, swaying slightly to the rhythm that had set dancing all magical things, the Princess Lyrizel, with that faint gleam on her face that shone from a hidden smile, for she secretly smiled forever at the power of her great beauty. And all in a sudden moment the elf king raised one hand higher, and held it high, and stilled all that dancing in Elfland, and gripped by a sudden awe all magical things, and sent over Elfland a melody all made of notes he had caught from wandering inspirations that sing and stray through limpid blue beyond our earthly coasts. And all the land lay deep in the magic of that strange music. And the wild things that earth had guessed at, and the things hidden even from legend, were moved to sing age-old songs that their memories had forgotten. And fabulous things of the air were lured downwards out of great heights, and emotions unknown and unthought of troubled the calm of Elfland. The flood of music beat with wonderful waves against the slopes of the grave blue elfin mountains, till their precipices uttered strange bronze-like echoes. On earth no noise was heard of music or echo, not a note came through the narrow border of twilight, not a sound, not a murmur. Elsewhere those notes ascended, and passed like rare strange moths through all the fields of heaven, and hummed like untraceable memories about the souls of the blessed, and the angels heard that music, but were forbidden to envy it. And though it came not to earth, and though never our fields have heard the music of Elfland, yet there were then, as there have been in every age, lest despair should overtake the peoples of earth, those that make songs for the need of our grief and our laughter, and even they heard never a note from Elfland across the border of twilight that kills their sound, but they felt in their minds the dance of those magical notes, and wrote them down, and earthly instruments played them. Then and never till then have we heard the music of Elfland. For a while the Elf King held all things that owed him allegiance, and all their desires and wonders and fears and dreams, floating drowsy on tides of music that was made of no sounds of earth, but rather of that dim substance in which the planets swim, with many another marvel that only magic knows. And then, as all Elfland was drinking the music in, as our earth drinks in soft rain, he turned again to his daughter with that in his eyes that said, "What land is so fair as ours?" And she turned towards him to say, "Here is my home forever." Her lips were parted to say it, and love was shining in the blue of her elfin eyes. She was stretching her fair hands out towards her father, when they heard the sound of the horn of a tired hunter, wearily blowing by the border of earth.
Your saga may vary.